The research program focused on extreme events is led by the San Jose University Research Foundation through the Mineta Transportation Institute. Funding for projects was provided by the Federal Railroad Administration's Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvements Program. The University of Hawaii and the National Disaster Preparedness Training Center, in partnership with Haley and Aldrich and the Pacific Disaster Center, lead the development of the Community Resilience Extreme Events Portal. The primary goal of the portal is to enhance alerting, early warning, and decision-making capabilities to reduce rail-associated fatalities, injuries, economic losses, and disruptions due to weather and other hazards. The portal will provide a one-stop solution platform for data and knowledge sharing for FRA industry stakeholders to improve early coordination, risk communications, and mitigation prioritization. The portal will host outputs from research on wildfire risk factors affecting railways, including relevant wildfire indices, environmental site data, critical impacts, mitigation strategies, and vulnerability rankings that help communicate comparative risk levels across the network. This presentation is to report on two phases of the Community Resilience Extreme Events Portal project, with focus on the development of a vulnerability assessment framework and its integration into the Disasterware platform developed and hosted by the Pacific Disaster Center. Phase 1 of the project included a literature review, engagement with stakeholders and railway representatives, and a proof of concept case study. The purpose of the literature review was to assess the current state-of-the-art knowledge and resources in the context of wildfire risk to railways and the potential risk of wildfire ignition from railways. Active wildfires pose a direct threat to railway infrastructure in areas with abundant fuels, extreme fire weather, and steep terrain. While characteristics of railway infrastructure and operations such as electrified rail increase the risk of ignition of new wildfires. The literature review summarized datasets, models, and methods for evaluating wildfire risk, as well as mitigation and response measures commonly used to increase resilience to wildfire. Interviews with rail industry stakeholders supplemented the literature review and informed the selection of datasets and models. Input was solicited regarding how the portal might best serve its users. These discussions informed the development of a vulnerability assessment framework. The last stage of Phase 1 was the development of a proof of concept and framework for assessing vulnerability. This preliminary research helped identify rail segments with the greatest exposure to wildfire risk. Publicly available wildfire-related data, including burn probability, land cover, fire suppression, and a fire danger metric, were used to evaluate two segments, which were analyzed further during the next phase. The vulnerability assessment framework used in this project builds off other indicator-based vulnerability assessments, such as the U.S. Department of Transportation Vulnerability Assessment Scoring Tool, designed to help state departments and metropolitan planning organizations document and quantify the vulnerability of their transportation assets. Vulnerability is a function of exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. Certain characteristics of hazard stressors in transportation assets can serve as indicators of their exposure, sensitivity, or adaptive capacity, and combined can produce relative vulnerability scores. Exposure refers to how wildfire hazard overlaps with railroad infrastructure, or the values at risk. Sensitivity refers to the characteristics of a system that influence the severity of the impacts when exposed. Adaptive capacity refers to the ability of a system to adjust to potential damages, take advantage of opportunities, or respond to consequences. Critical segments of the rail line were determined and selected based on whether they are Class 1 freight, passenger, and STRACnet. STRACnet is a continuous rail line with over 41,000 miles of track in the United States that serves the Department of Defense. Only rail lines designated as all three categories were considered due to higher traffic intensities, greater potential for freight loss and impact to hazardous materials, and potential for human injury. Exposure to segments of the rail line were examined using a 2-kilometer buffer zone, which represents the average distance of ember travel. Exposure factors that may increase the risk of wildfire include continuous fuels available to burn, low fuel moisture content, steep slopes, high winds, extreme temperatures, human activity that could ignite a fire, and areas where human development closely intermixes with undeveloped wildlands, also known as the wildland-urban interface. Exposure metrics were selected using 3 data sets: United States Forest Service burn probability, presence of campgrounds, and total area of wildfire-urban interface and intermix zone. These data sets are publicly available and robustly account for the landscape, meteorological, and human drivers of wildfire. Burn probability was used as the only indicator of wildfire risk on the landscape to avoid issues related to spatial autocorrelation and erroneously attributing higher levels of exposure to rail lines through the use of multiple similar indices. Wildland-urban interface and campgrounds represent the critical contribution of human-related risk factors to California's fire regime. The 2 segments identified in Phase 1 of this work are shown here. The bolded lines indicate high-risk segments that are located within 2 kilometers of a very high burn probability. Rail infrastructure is sensitive to wildfire due to the use of wooden materials in bridges and ties, and metal components that may warp when exposed to extreme heat. Rail assets, such as rail grade crossings and passenger and freight stations, are also sensitive to wildfire due to the presence of electrical equipment and the potential for wildfire-related impacts to passenger safety, as well as delays and disruptions, which may result in cascading financial and/or reputational impacts. While active fires directly threaten rail infrastructure, the risk of new wildfires igniting increases with high rail traffic, hot engines, braking and exhaust components, and electrified railways. Adaptive capacity refers to the ability of rail operations or the system to respond and adapt during an event. This may include fire prevention strategies, early warning systems, redundancies, and community preparedness. Indicators identified to represent adaptive capacity include distance to fire stations, total area of road network, and the presence of rail tunnels. The proximity of fire stations to individual rail segments and the total distance of road network may result in faster response times and easier accessibility to critical points along the fire's perimeter. The presence of rail tunnels increases vulnerability due to the high cost of repairs, difficulty of rerouting, and the cascading effects of a single disruption. The indicators for each component of the vulnerability assessment framework are shown here. Class 1 freight and passenger rail lines were segmented at approximately 1 kilometer. All metrics, except for the presence of tunnels, were calculated within a 2-kilometer buffer zone surrounding each segment, while only tunnels located along the rail segment were assessed. All indicators used to calculate exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity are shown here. The 3 exposure indicators, burn probability, campgrounds, and wildland-urban interface, were obtained from the U.S. Forest Service. The 4 sensitivity indicators were obtained from the U.S. Department of Transportation. Adaptive capacity indicators, including fire station location data, was obtained from CAL FIRE, and road network and tunnel locations from Caltrans. Individual values for each indicator were calculated at each rail segment and transformed to fit within a scale of 0 to 100 using min-max normalization. Minimum and maximum values were determined using all rail segments, such that 0 is the minimum value and 100 is the maximum value. The kilometers of road network indicator uses an inverted scale of 100 to 0, so that vulnerability decreases as the total length of road increases. The presence of tunnels uses a yes or no option, so vulnerability will increase with the presence of a tunnel. Weights were assigned to each component of the framework exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity, based on expert judgment and the scientific literature. Each overall component of the framework was assigned a weight, 0.4 for exposure and 0.3 for sensitivity and adaptive capacity. Exposure was weighted more heavily because weather, vegetation, landscape, and human factors are understood to be the leading factors of wildfire risk. Each indicator is also assigned a weight ranging from 0.25 to 0.5, with burn probability being most heavily weighted. This figure shows two of the high-risk areas identified in the first phase of this work. Segment 4 is located in Southern California, north of San Bernardino, in a mountainous corridor referred to as Cajon Pass. And Segment 2 is located in Northern California, near Shasta Lake. The vulnerability index was calculated for each of the 1-kilometer segments and ranges from 20.6 to 58 across both sample areas. This slide shows the entirety of the Segment 2 sample area on the left and a zoomed-in subset on the right. In the subset, we highlight sample segments with moderate, high, and very high vulnerability scores to illustrate how variations in exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity impact final scores. Across the sample area, the vulnerability scores range from 31.7 to 58. The exposure ranges from 38 to 79. Sensitivity from 0 to 19.8, and adaptive capacity ranges from 27.5 to 88.6. The very high vulnerability segment had an exposure score of 79. This elevated score is attributed to the segment's high burn probability and the presence of 3 campgrounds, which increase the risk of human-caused ignition. The high vulnerability segment is characterized by the largest area of wildland-urban interface. This interface between human development and wildland vegetation is more prone to human-caused ignition, rapid spread of a wildfire, and can be difficult to suppress. Sensitivity scores for all 3 segments were relatively low. Notably, there were no Amtrak stations within these segments. However, each segment had at least one rail grade crossing, bridge, and a freight station within a 2-kilometer radius, which contributed to the overall vulnerability. The high vulnerability segment also had the highest adaptive capacity score, indicating a lower level of preparedness for wildfire threats. Both the high and very high segments contain tunnels, which increases their overall vulnerability. Proximity to fire stations and the extent of road networks further influence the vulnerability assessment. The high vulnerability segment, despite being the farthest from a fire station, had the most extensive road network, potentially aiding firefighting efforts. Conversely, the moderate segment, closest to a fire station, had the least road network. This slide shows the entirety of the Segment 4 sample area on the left and a zoomed-in subset on the right. In the larger Segment 4 area, vulnerability scores ranged from 20.6 to 53, exposure ranged from 14.3 to 62.6, sensitivity from 0 to 70, and adaptive capacity from 21.9 to 61.6. The exposure score for all 3 sample segments was 50, which was, in part, a result of all 3 segments being located within 2 kilometers of a very high burn probability area. The influence of human activity on wildfire risk was minimal in these segments, as there were no campgrounds and area-designated wildland-urban interface was minimal. Sensitivity scores varied widely among the 3 segments. The very high segment had 11 bridges, 11 rail crossings, and 3 freight stations within 2 kilometers, which resulted in a sensitivity score of 47, while the moderate segment had 4 bridges, 3 rail crossings, 1 freight station, and a sensitivity score of 15. The adaptive capacity results indicate the moderate, high, and very high segments were progressively farther from the nearest fire station, which may lead to longer firefighting response times. However, the very high segment had the largest total distance of road network, which can facilitate access for firefighting efforts, thereby reducing overall vulnerability. Also, the absence of tunnels increased adaptive capacity and reduced the overall vulnerability of the 3 segments. Moving into the second phase of the project, integrating the data from the vulnerability framework into DisasterAware, a platform of the Pacific Disaster Center. We'll cover an introduction to the DisasterAware platform, some demonstration of the vulnerability framework data in DisasterAware, and demonstration of additional functionality to leverage the framework data, in particular asset protection. Moving into the second phase, we'll discuss the integration of the vulnerability framework into the DisasterAware platform of the Pacific Disaster Center. We'll cover an introduction to the DisasterAware platform, a demonstration of the vulnerability framework data in DisasterAware, and a demonstration of additional functionality to leverage the framework data. PDC's DisasterAware application is a global alerting platform able to integrate source data on a variety of natural and man-made hazards. As an information portal, it provides a global view of current hazards and the data associated with them in a graphic visualization that is driven by the user. It provides situational awareness in the form of maps and reports generated automatically for the hazards. As a decision support tool, it provides concise information on current status and underlying risk. DisasterAware also enables widespread and configurable alerting to users in text and email format. Additionally, the application enables asset tracking for users to track stationary or moving assets such as buildings, personnel, or goods in transit, and receive alerts when a hazard poses a potential threat. The user community for the system includes local, state, and federal agencies, international and regional organizations, as well as other national governments. Now a demonstration using the Vulnerability Assessment Framework data and leveraging it in DisasterAware to use layers and manage risk to assets. This is DisasterAware, the disaster management platform built by the Pacific Disaster Center. We've integrated output data from the Vulnerability Assessment Framework for the sample areas and beyond, and can show just some of the capabilities to function as a portal. What we see on the screen are the rail network lines in California, just east of Los Angeles in the Cajon Junction area. We're showing their level of wildfire risk and exposure as shown by the red and orange colors. You can click on each segment and see the name and location of that rail segment, the overall vulnerability score, as well as the adaptive capacity score, the sensitivity score, and the exposure score. Also, the length of the segment in miles. Next, we can go to our notifications and see how these lines can be used in protection alerting for rail assets. When we go to the notifications, it shows 78 assets are in view of the zoom level of this map. This project used 1 kilometer buffers of the rail lines for notifications so that any hazard that came within 1 kilometer of the asset would trigger an alert. You can choose which hazard you're monitoring. In our case, we'll be using the wildfires. As you zoom out, you'll see more of the buffered rail network lines show up, and the number of assets increases. For this demonstration, we've triggered a test wildfire hazard to pop up in the area near Cajon Junction. You'll see that the PDC active hazards layers are updating. Then you'll see the new notification in the right blue panel, and the new wildfire hazard has popped onto the screen. You can click on that hazard and get additional information about the wildfire. You can also share a link to the hazard, as well as view products and wildfire relevant layers. Going back to the notifications, we've built our settings in asset protection, so we'll get alerts if any of these assets fall within that smart alert area of the wildfire. Back in asset protection, we can see that we have 3 layers that we're monitoring with this service: rail freight stations, rail tunnels, and selected project rail areas. For rail stations, you can see that we choose settings for our report, including the refresh rate and the buffer around those stations. For our rail lines, we have many more asset fields to choose from,
so we selected all of the scores to show up in the report, as well as the length of the rail impacted. You can click on any of the buffered lines and get to the data table with the additional information about that segment. As we click on segments in the map, the data table changes. When we have the hazard show up, we'll first get an email alert to the wildfire hazard. That brings us to asset protection reporting. After the alert email, if you have assets set up, you'll receive an asset hazard exposure report. At the bottom of the report, you can see a breakdown of selected fields with the length in kilometer and miles of rail impacted. Because some lines are represented more than one track, we also included the total number of tracks impacted in those 97 segments, which is 142. Back in DisasterWare, I can click on that hazard and get to the asset report from the app as well and see the same information. Data for the Community Resilience Extreme Events Portal are now being processed and implemented for the entire state of California, and there are plans to expand the scope to the entire West Coast. The results from the Vulnerability Assessment Framework will be distributed through the portal, and feedback from the users and stakeholders will be used to update the indicator weights as needed, and to make necessary improvements to the functionality and applicability of the vulnerability information and the portal.